Managers are known in, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold, so forgive me with my voice, but there's care facilitators, care advisors, care managers, case managers, facilitators, coordinators, care coordinators, just about anything that you can imagine. So I do from time to time drop in and out of different terms as we're going along. So we'll be looking at, as I said, the role of the consumer and how that's changed over time. We're looking at what consumer self-management or self-direction actually, what constitutes that. I'll be looking at prioritising care needs and spending parameters by giving some examples of how others have used their care packages, so some of the more common spending items as well as some of the more flexible and creative. We're looking at objective decision making. At the moment, there is no objective measure for what the home care packages funding can be spent on, other than by, it's very subjective. So somebody might say, well, I think it means this, and somebody else will interpret it differently. Some people will ring the department, some people will ring My Aged Care, some people, there is no consistently applicable way of deciding what's okay and what's not okay. And that can be to the detriment of the consumer. Well, also just at the end, we'll be looking at what the back of house requirements are. So we'll get to that in just a moment. I think we might have some action here. Let's see. Bingo. Okay, so we talked earlier, Jonathan's mentioned once or twice about that the consumers don't know what they don't know. And I remembered one day when somebody said that about Donald Rumsfeld saying something very famous years ago. So I've put that up here for you. And this is really just as applicable in the sector that we're talking about as it was in the political environment in which it was first said. So there are known knowns. These are the things that we know that we know. There are the known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. These are the things we don't know, And I think that's a tremendous way to start this conversation. Okay, so most of these things, because we do have a lot to get through, so I have to get cracking. So I can't really labour on too much information, but there's heaps of stuff that you can find online about what case management actually is all about. But this is a nice, neat little graphic here. But broadly speaking, case management is that all-encompassing, collaborative and ongoing process which includes but is not limited to these elements. And it's the personal touches that help to build those all-important relationships between consumers and the case manager with their family members and any of the other services and allies that are involved. And Simon also spoke very eloquently this morning about the importance of relationships as being the heart of success in home care packages. So the role of the care manager is extremely varied, but these are a couple of these. I've got 2 pages just of some points here which talk about that. On a practice level, I suppose these are the types of things that would need to occur, but for the outcomes to be meaningful to the consumer, a supportive and friendly relationship is absolutely essential. Here's another group of roles that encompasses, and each one of those can be broken down obviously into many, many component parts. To say that there is a new role for consumers is a really interesting point, because they always had a role, but it was just a much more passive recipient of care rather than now being so much more their expectations that they are more engaged and more involved in the service that they're using. So the operational manual clearly defines, or clearly articulates, I should say, that consumers should be involved in activities that help them to regain or maintain some of their physical and cognitive capacities, and things that can promote their health and wellness. So we all want clients to be more informed about home care packages that are provided to them. We want them to assume more control over their care. And at the core of the aged care reforms are a more balanced partnership, which transfers decisional authority from the care manager or the provider to the consumer themselves. So it's expected that the consumers will be more involved in delivery and planning of their care and services, and it's expected that clients will continue to make the kinds of choices that they've typically made throughout their lives. And lastly, of course, that relates to having partnership approaches in co-design or co-production. This is a quote from one of the carers that's been very involved, as Annette has, with Home Care Today in the last couple of 6 months or so, if you'd like to have a quick look at that. So with Amira, she's talking about how they noticed with the transition to consumer-directed care that their case managers became much more officious and bureaucratic, and that would be something, as new providers into this space, you don't have a what you used to be like and now what you are like and what you're like now. You're coming into it at a completely different level to what the service providers from the old models have actually been in, and I think in some respects that's a great advantage. So what is consumer self-management or self-direction? Essentially, this client-directed care requires a transfer of knowledge, capacity and control over resources from the aged care provider and care managers to the consumer. So the ability of case managers to devolve their knowledge of the system is a key to the success of CDC for the future. And this ability is not only about the skills of the care manager, but it also requires that they are supported by their organisation to effectively engage their clients in that way. So it's not much good to have case managers that are very CDC compliant if they don't understand how they can devolve that information to their consumers. So what I'll do is I'll just run through some of the activities of self-direction or self-management, and these are the things that the consumers or clients themselves need to know. So they do need to understand what it means to have more involvement and more control from their perspective. So the first thing is around self-assessment or assessment. So just in general, everyone does an assessment of needs for their consumers, but very often some of the better programs seem to engage the clients in doing a self-assessment. So before you actually start doing your own paper-based version, is you get the clients to reflect on where they are at, where they see themselves against a whole range of different measures of functional abilities and for functional capacity around how they actually feel about their care and the situation that they're in at the moment. So that's the first part in a very holistic assessment. So and there's a range of resources that you can find online, and I'll just briefly touch on that at the end about some free practice tools and things that you can access, which does have self-assessment as one of those, and that was a very important part of a research project that I was in, and very much welcomed by the consumers involved. Setting, and this is about prioritising the essential care needs, what really needs to happen in the first instance to just get past that perhaps acute phase when you're first starting off with a home care package, and then how you can start to unravel that a little bit and start to get more aspirational things that the clients, what makes them tick, the kind of things that are going to make them want to get up in the mornings and engage into back into life again as they knew it. Choice of services from a range of service options based on the best fit for their identified care needs. Consumers need to know how to make decisions around service variations, authority to allocate package resources, all that sort of thing. So someone that's self-directing at a high level needs to understand exactly what they can actually do and at what the parameters are around them to make decisions about where to allocate the funding that they do have. Making changes, these could be simple things that just about anyone can do, where the service provider that's delivering the actual direct care can be contacted directly by the consumer to make small changes. If someone's got an appointment next Tuesday and they've got someone coming to do, a physiotherapist coming to do some support with them, they should be able just to ring the physio and change the time. So as long as it's not necessarily increasing or decreasing what's already involved, many consumers appreciate being able to be the single point of contact for the service provider. And just before I go on, I think I just wanted to clarify that there are a couple of very often we hear this confusion between a service provider and a provider or approved provider, and they are actually different things. So you have an approved provider, which is usually just abbreviated to provider, but that's not necessarily the same. That's not the same thing as the service provider. The service provider is the deliverer of services, not the package host, if you like. So the provider is the host of the package. The service provider are the ones that deliver the care. The providers subcontract to those service providers. So it's a really important distinction, even though I don't mean to labour on it. And of course you have the other issue with a lot of direct care workers being called carers. So you've got carers and carers, providers and providers. It can sometimes get quite confusing. So it would help you to be able to differentiate what those differences are for the clients that you work with. Another activity of self-direction is around managing budgets. So managing the monthly budget expenditure, keeping track of spending. People, again, at a higher level of self-direction can keep a diary. So they don't necessarily, very often reporting the financial reports that come to consumers are not in real time. In fact, they're not in any known time. They are sometimes months and months behind. So it's not a true up-to-date reflection of what's going on with the care packages. And some providers have come to using what's called the card, what do I call them? A stored value card, which has real-time information and it's like a debit card that money is loaded onto it. The consumers can actually use that to purchase care directly, and they can view online exactly how much they've actually spent. So if my husband can find out that I've bought a pair of shoes before I get home from work, then I think it's not too unrealistic to say that that consumers should be able to find real-time information about their spending activities. There's got to be a way that can do that, and if anyone comes up with it, that would be really, really fantastic. And lastly, there is the self-direction activities around monitoring and reporting on the quality of the services that they receive. At Home Care today, we have regular correspondence from consumers and carers around the country, and we did an analysis of all the information that had come to us in that maybe a couple of months after the transition date on July last year in 2015. Then we did another analysis earlier this year, a couple of months ago, and found that the issues were actually slightly different. So very, very quickly, and we've had someone's mentioned earlier about complaints really being 80% of complaints being about the dollar value that was being apportioned from packages towards administration and or core advisory or case management services. Now, one of the things which I noticed is that we were getting just as many complaints from consumers that were paying 20% altogether as we were from consumers paying 45% altogether. We thought, well, that's really interesting. What are the commonalities? And the commonalities were around these things. The lack of contact or support from the care advisor. So where previously people had been used to having a 6 to 8 week home visit that was mandated under their home care package, under their, say, level 2 or CAPS package in the past, suddenly some people said they haven't seen their case manager for 10 months, which was just, that was the issue. They're saying, I don't mind paying 20%, but I want to see somebody, or I don't mind paying 45%, but I want to see somebody. There was a lot of issues around the inflexibility of spending parameters, where somebody was being told on one hand that they couldn't have food thickener for their person with swallowing difficulties. That was not allowed to be funded under the package because that was food. Okay? That's a very, very small but really significant example of how subjective those sorts of things have been and still are. There's complaints around the poor information on CDC or home care packages in general. I think that goes without saying. Lack of communication from the provider at both an organisational and at the case manager or advisor level. Lack of choice of direct service provider. So some people saying that they are having to have their showers at 11:30 a.m. when what they really want is someone at 8 o'clock in the morning because there aren't enough staff to go around. And it's like, well, it's simple, just find an organisation that's got someone available at 8 o'clock. But many of the approved providers are only purchasing the care in-house if they have their own brokerage, if they have their own service provision. Many of the people were complaining about a very, very basic care plan, something that was literally was like from a menu of services, which might constitute maybe, Okay, so how can you address these sorts of issues? Pretty straightforward. A really holistic assessment, fantastic information that is simplified and goes straight to the heart of what the issues are around home care packages, the objectives of home care packages, the principles of consumer-directed care. They need a consumer-led prioritisation of care needs. It's up to the consumer to decide what is the most important thing for them, not just based on who you've got in your what you usually do for other clients. Consumers would like a timetable of contact with their case manager. So map it out in advance. Have a plan. People like predictability. They like to know what to expect. So if you say, I will call you, give or take, every 4 or 5 weeks and check in with you. Then put that in your calendar, put that in their calendar. They need to know when you're going to be visiting, when things are going to happen, bearing in mind that sometimes you've got issues that need to be dealt with in an emergency. Consumers wanted connections to their community. They want individual and flexible care planning, and they want regular monitoring of the consumer input and outcomes. Here's a little cartoon that was in one of the Alzheimer's Australia's publications. Rather cute. All right, so moving right along. Everything that we do as care providers and care managers and direct care workers really matters to the consumer. We've heard that reiterated from a lot of the consumers that we've spoken to in the past. Everything we do really does matter. Also, everything we do needs to be measured up against something. So we have the home care standards. We know that the quality agency come and do their bit, but it's not enough just to be compliant. You have to be looking at what are the objectives of a home care package. So every time we do something, there needs to be a collective decision about, if we're making collective decisions about how to deliver and provide services. There's a bunch of questions that we've come up with at Home Care today that we think will really help to streamline things. These questions came from consumers. So if you're talking about delivering a service or purchasing a particular item, you need to ask yourself, does this improve the health and well-being of my consumer? Or you could get this, the clients were asking themselves, so I'll do this from their perspective. Does this maintain my role in my family or community? Does this address social and cultural connectedness? Does this improve or enhance my quality of life? Does this help me to be more involved in my own care? Does this maintain my independence and control? And have we explored alternative methods of funding? Sometimes people have ideas of things that they need or want to have built into their care plan, and what often happens is that the care manager will get to a point and say, stop there, that's where the budget ends. So we're not going to write down any more of those goals. We're not going to write down any more of those things that you need. That doesn't seem to be the right thing to do. It's about getting the whole picture of what's going to help that consumer and then finding other ways of meeting those needs. The home care package budget is but one way of meeting what are a whole bunch of other issues for that particular person. I'll just lastly, when you're looking at your own policies and procedures, your practice tools and your client care goals and all that sort of stuff, you need to be saying how well do all of those things measure up against these home care package objectives. All right, flexible spending. This is something I get lots and lots of questions about. I had a question last week, which is something that happens all the time, but this one, there's a gentleman, it was a client, emailed me and said, I've looked on everything I can find online and I can't find anything that tells me how many hours of care do I get on a level 2 package. So I wrote back and I said, you will never find anything that tells you And in fact, you shouldn't ever find anything that tells you how many hours of care you get on a level 2 package or any other level, because that's not how packages work. They are a brokerage amount. It's dollars that we're talking about here, not hours of care. There are equally as many people that use their packages in hours as there are people who use them in dollars. So I know of some consumers who have used every cent of their package on taxi fares to get to and from dialysis 3 times a week. That's not an hour of care. You can't quantify that in a unit cost in that way. So developing a unit cost for services is a very complex thing because you're not measuring like with like. And because every consumer is different, you're going to be needing to have what you'd have to have about 50,000 different unit costs. I know this is terribly messy to see something like this up on the screen with all those words, but you'll get a copy of this in your resources. But what this is telling you, on the left-hand side, these are very common spending items, things that you would typically expect to see. However, on the right-hand side, these are examples of the endless list of actual services and items and anything expenditure that you could have under a home care package. And every single one of those has been, all of the things that are on the right, as well as all the things on the left, need to appear in the consumer's care plan. They need to be part of a goal that actually is reflected in the documentation that you keep. For the most part, they need to have an outcome that is around health and wellness and well-being for that consumer as well. So we're looking at if it might be something to do with independence. We have at the top there on the right, the first box, there was companion pet. This came up at a conference that I was at, and there were people from the department there and from the quality agency, and there was no issues in terms of purchasing a companion pet where there was a justifiable and very tangible reason to have a pet that was actually going to fill the need or the void that was there in that consumer's life, who had zero mobility, couldn't really do a whole lot of stuff for themselves, couldn't get out and about, and had no family or anyone to really relate to. But the time in their life where they were the most happy, when they asked them in their assessments, what do you love? What do you miss? I miss having a little lap dog that can just, jump up and sleep with me on my bed and sit on my lap. And so things like that. If there is asking yourself those questions that we had before, you can find that just about anything can actually can actually be reflected under the acceptable spending parameters. Okay, so individualised care planning, how to begin. Just a minute, how much time have I got left?
Still got 10 minutes.
Is that all? Okay. Seriously, is that all? Okay. All right. So I'm just going to have to really hammer through this one. All right. So what we're talking about with the individualised planning is, of course, you get started with your developing a personal story with your client and understanding, as I said a moment ago, what is it that really lights their fire? What makes them tick? What do they miss? What is the things that used to really get them involved in life in the past? And then try to use that as your foundation. And a goal such as remain living in my own home, well, to me, that's an outcome. And so if you use that, you can use that as an outcome for something. It's not necessarily the goal. But if you are making that, if that's what the client says is their goal, then what you need to identify from there is what do you need to do or to have to make that a reality. And that's what forms the actual care plan. So these are ordered by number order, not just in dot points, and that's really deliberate because this is how I see things, to be asking the consumer to look at, not at this point in time, not even starting to talk about what services do you need. It's about what do you need that's going to help you to care for yourself. What are the priorities? So you start with care for myself, risks and safety, health and medical, and care for my home. And then you move into the next side, which is to break those into 2 different parts. These 3 are the things that are all very personal and very specific to that person. And addressing those needs are the key to helping someone remain living in their own home. Then we've still got number 4. Number 4 relates to the comfort and care of the environment, but it's not necessarily the thing that's going to help someone remain living in their own home. So it's not to say that home care doesn't have a place in home care packages. Of course it does. But if it if the issue is about getting the client to be more involved in doing some of the tasks around the house that may be domestic tasks, then you could push that back up into the care for myself, or health and medical, because it's starting to look at re-abling that person to be involved in the things around the house. But if it's just around caring for the home, someone who uses the money to purchase a treadmill is less likely to have a fall and end up in an acute situation, compared to someone who only uses the package to pay for, say, cleaning of something. Yeah, so if you've got the clean bathroom is not necessarily the thing that's going to help them live at home independently. There might be other ways that you can meet this goal, but maybe the home care package isn't the first option. Okay, moving right along. Let's look at what your organisation's decision-making framework actually is. This is a commonly used where you've got your client who asks the care manager if can I have something or other. The care advisor says, I'm not sure, I'll have to go back and take that to my manager, who then gives the feedback to the care advisor, who tells the client. It's that kind of is at odds with the whole notion of consumer-directed care. So what you need to be thinking about is, what is the organisation's consistent procedure for considering client requests? What is the objective criteria against which these requests are assessed? How does the organisation's policies or procedures stack up against those home care package objectives that we went through before? What are the parameters for care managers to make decisions on the spot? And what are the parameters for the consumers themselves to make decisions in advance, so that they can decide what they want to spend the money on? This is the top half of a tool which I developed, which was just used as a means of trying to show that if you can link the home care package objectives with the consumer-directed care principles, and then by giving people the opportunity to make decisions about what they can and want to spend their care package funds on, and the consumers can fill this in themselves. So they simply have a think about, what is it that I might like to use my package for? And then they have to ask themselves those questions. You don't have to have an answer to, it doesn't have to be a yes for all of them, but it has to be a yes to at least some of them. And then moving the bottom part of that form, which you'll get in your resources, looks at a quick risk assessment of that as well. So on the left, we've got capacity building and enabling risk. Well, that doesn't mean much to a consumer, but underneath that it says what that means is, how can we make this happen? Will their other needs suffer as a result? So if someone wants to purchase a dog, but it means they're not going to have a shower for 6 months because they've spent all their money, clearly there's a balance there. It's pretty self-explanatory anyway. But this is some way that you can go to having the decisions made up to a certain dollar value, whatever it happens to be, where people say, if you can say yes to these things and to these questions that do relate, we know that if they can relate to these, that it's pretty well acceptable under the care packages. I'm almost done, Jonathan. So, in summary, in addition to providing authorities to your case managers, your organisation needs to carefully consider what the end result is that you desire for the consumers of your service. So if you want your clients to understand and embrace the concepts of that consumer-directed care can actually provide, then you need to work backwards. Okay, so you're starting at this point. We want autonomous and informed clients. We want them to be happy and satisfied and empowered, and etc. If you want that, then you need skilled case managers. They need a thorough understanding of consumer-directed care, a thorough understanding of the aged care system. They need to be good mentors. They need to do good risk assessments. They need to understand safeguarding principles. But if you want your case managers that are creative and skillful and CDC compliant and ask all the right questions of their consumers, you've got to work backwards from that as well. That means that to a large extent the buck stops with the organisation itself. So your agency information, your philosophies and practice tools, your documentation, your training calendar, and all of those things that are listed down there, they need to be such that your case managers can have everything at their fingertips to enable them to practice good quality consumer-directed care practices in its intended way. So as I said before, it's no good teaching your case managers to be person-centred and goal-directed and flexible if your agency doesn't have the mechanisms to allow them to do that properly. So good documentation and policies and procedures are the equivalent of a tradie's tools, and without the right tools, you only get half the job. So I just want to take a quick opportunity to wish you all very, very well on your journey with the home care packages, and to let you know that we do have a fuller version of this abbreviated case management and goal-directed care planning and all that. We have a much fuller version if you wanted to have a chat with us about that. Are we having time for questions? Okay.
Thank you, Anna.